Moccasin Trail, Chapter 3. Jim slept fitfully. At daybreak next morning, he was off upstream to lift his traps. As if to underscore Tom's bleak words of last night, 5 of them were empty. But as he came to the place near the big mud-plastered lodge where he had set the 6th one, he saw that the trap pole was gone. He swore under his breath, then splashed into the water and peered about him in the gray half-light for the float stick. To snare one finally and then have it get away? It was an anxious few minutes before he spotted the stick, bobbing in a little eddy between 2 rocks, several yards downstream. By the time he had explored the bottom of the stream for 5 feet around it and finally located the trap, he was soaked from head to foot and all but frozen. But he was grinning as he hauled his beaver to the bank. It was a prime catch. It weighed 60 pounds if it weighed an ounce, and had the finest pelt he had ever seen. A good omen. He made short work of the skinning and hurried, shivering, back to camp. Tom was there ahead of him, roasting buffalo ribs for breakfast. "Any luck, hoss?" he drawled. "One. A good 'un. How about you?" 6 empties. Jim bent to tousle Mocky's ears, feeling unhappy. Tom should have got one too this morning, just for a good sign. "Listen, Tom, you take that plew." "Wah, not much. I got too much to pack around as 'tis. Come, get some grub, you coyote." With an uncertain smile, Jim did as he was told. He felt a little embarrassed in Tom's presence after all that talking last night, and he ate in silence. But Tom paid no attention to that. His eyes were as bland as his drawl, as careless as ever. While Jim set about rough curing the beaver pelt, he gathered his possibles and began breaking camp as if this were the same as any other morning in the world. Jim's clothes were dry by the time he had the plew stretched on its willow hoop. He left Tom to quelch the fire and went to free Buckskin from her stake. She was eager to be gone. She had been stamping and snuffling the wind restlessly and tossing her white mane. Murmuring under his breath to soothe her, he strapped on the apishamore, the buffalo hide blanket he used for a saddle. With a last caress of her sleek neck, he whistled to Moki to guard her while he dealt with the mule. Rivers watched out of the corner of his eye, grinning as he tightened Tucky's cinch. Bad Medicine had already emerged from the thicket and was standing with apparent docility beside the pack. Remember what Bad Medicine is?
No.
His mule. But at the first touch of Jim's hands, he flattened his long ears, buckled his middle, and aimed a kick that would have broken a man's leg had it landed. Tom's laugh burst out as Jim, used to the ways of mules, and this one in particular, merely leapt clear, muttering a few remarks in the crow tongue that would have singed holes in anything less tough than the mule hide. Tom strolled over, still shaking with laughter. "Here, hoss, I'll blindfold that there primer donner for you this morning, seeing as it's the last time I'll get to see the show." He did so quickly and efficiently with a strip of old blanket. By some mysterious, mulish logic, this convinced Bad Medicine that he was a pack animal instead of a spoiled beauty, and he stood quite still while Jim cinched the pack in place. "So they blindfold the mule so it'll behave." "I'm going to miss that critter," Tom chuckled. "By gor, you can have him then." Jim grinned and whipped the blindfold off, then with a last look around, vaulted to Buckskin's back. She was in swift motion almost before he was seated, and Bad Medicine, who loved her with that mad devotion possible only to a mule's heart, kept close behind as they started down the mountain toward the Powder River. "Good day for huntin', if we was to spot an elk," Tom remarked. "Looky here, Moki's at it already." Jim glanced down at the dog, running along in front, tail aloft and nose to the ground. "Go find us an elk, Moki," he urged. "Go on, get at it." Moki looked up absently out of his yellow eyes. His mind was on rabbits. "Oh, well, I'm full anyhow," Tom drawled and laughed. It was so much like any other day, and yet it was the last. With every hoofbeat, the final minutes of this good familiar life were running out, and parting with Tom was drawing nearer. They feigned indifference, both of them. Feigned means like pretended. Until they descended the last slope and pulled up on the flat stretch beside the river. "Best let the horses breathe a minute," Jim mumbled. He was feeling oddly short of breath himself. "Yeah, Tucky's plumb winded." They sat in silence for a while, looking at the river, the wind in the treetops, the rumpled manes of their horses, anywhere but at each other. But finally Tom turned. "Hoss, this is where I head south." "I reckon so, Tom." You sartin you don't want to come along with me?" Jim hesitated, in spite of himself. Then his hand crept to his pouch in which rested that powerful paper. He shook his head. "Well?" Tom wheeled Tucky close to Buckskin's flank and thrust out his hand. Jim gripped it with all his strength. "Hoss," said Tom very softly, "take good care of that medicine of your'n, you hear?" Then he was gone, trotting swiftly through the leafless underbrush and yellowed grass, the familiar jingling of his traps growing fainter, his straight back and battered old hat smaller and smaller with distance. Jim watched until a wooded bend in the river hid him from view. Then he swung Buckskin's head northwest toward the Blue Mountains, beyond which lay the Dalles, and, with luck, some white trader who could read writin'. It took all his will to bring his heels back against the mare's flanks in the kick that would commit him, once and for all, to this strange new course. But once he was in motion, it seemed as though he could not go fast enough. Something over a week later, it would have been less had he not been forced to stop and hunt. He reined Buckskin in on a promontory overlooking the Dalles of Columbia. There, below him, boiled the mighty river, thrashing and foaming between its towering black walls as it plunged the cleft it had carved for itself through 50 miles of solid rock. This was the Columbia Gorge, most used passageway through the Cascade Mountains to the broad and fertile land bordering the Willamette River on the other side. Close at hand, to the west, rose the Cascades themselves, shining with snow, impassable, except at the gorge even for horsemen this time of year. Difficult enough last summer when Jim and Tom had wandered over briefly in a vain search for new trapping grounds, and back to the east stretched the 2,000 man-killing, beast-killing miles wagons must travel to reach this spot from the States. There were wagons here now, many of them. Jim could see them clustered there far below, in the last nook short of the actual rapids. Crowded about the dark spots that were the few buildings in the settlement of the Dalles, they looked like stubby gray grubs around chips. Jim stared down the timbered slope, half eager, half frightened, at the sight of those battered canvas tops. In another half hour he was threading his way among them, through a light misting rain, toward the largest of the log buildings, the trading post. As he rode, hands busy with his nervous mare, his eyes darted among the crowds of emigrants, who were everywhere he looked, huddled over campfires, tending oxen, clustered in groups to look fearfully at the thundering river. Jim found himself breathing hard, or else forgetting to breathe at all. So many people. Not mountain men or Indians or Mexicans like at Taos, but bourgeois from the States. That means white people. Folks dressed in fabrics instead of skins, wearing shoes and coats instead of moccasins and blanket furs. Families, women and children. He stared at them with sudden hunger, his pulse racing with the half-forgotten, half-familiar look of them. He had not seen a white woman or child for 9 years. They were staring at him too, curiosity briefly erasing the lines of weariness from their faces as he passed. Outside the trading post, he tethered his animals to the rail and spoke sharply to Moki, who was bristling with suspicion and trying to keep an eye on all 200 or 300 of the nearest bourgeois at once. Jim shared his uneasiness. His mouth was dry and he was sweating in the grizzly cloak, which had barely kept off the bitter wind 10 minutes before. He shucked it off and flung it over Buckskin's back. Then, with a last hesitating glance around, he tucked his rifle into the crook of his arm and stepped into the post. There were bourgeois here, too. The place was full of them. He flattened himself against the door as a group of 3 hurried past him. A sandy-haired young man and a woman accompanied by a snub-nosed boy of about 11, with a mass of blonde ringlets. The child stumbled as he went by and half fell against Jim, turned to pipe, "Excuse me," and stopped short to stare with great, wondering gray-green eyes. Jim stared back, fighting a purely Indian impulse to touch and finger that unbelievable yellow hair. Then the boy was gone. Darting after his companions, Jim stepped inside, dodged another couple, and moved slowly toward the wooden counter. At one glance, located the trader, the same one who had been here last summer. "Hello, Harris," Jim said in a voice that shook a little in spite of his best effort. He felt all these people were staring straight at him, though his common sense told him they were busy with their own affairs. He swallowed and forced carelessness into his quiet tone. "I was wondering, can you read writin'?" "Yep, good as a professor." Harris, busy measuring out a length of calico for a huge red-bearded man, didn't look up. "But I only trot out my learnin' for them as makes it worth my while. You got any—" Then he did look up and stopped dead, his coarse, beefy face twisting with surprise. "Well, if it ain't Injun Jim!" he roared, dropping the calico. "Say, you ain't come back to finish off poor old Whitebeard, have you? White Bear, have you?" "Who's White Bear?" muttered Jim. He was rigid with self-consciousness. At the man's bellow, every head in the room had turned in his direction. "Why, my old Chinook, White Bear. He's been a tolerable good Injun since you drapped round to teach him his manners last summer. He's the best canoeer I got. Leave him keep his hair." Jim didn't like the trader's laughter. He remembered the instant now. The old Chinook had tried to steal Buckskin, and he'd put an arrow through his hat by way of discipline. "Why, I ain't after no hair," he mumbled. He stopped as his sharp ears picked up the familiar ominous sound of Moki's snarl. He grunted, wheeled, and was out of the room before the surprised trader could open his mouth. The instant he hit the open air, he was conscious of danger. He had cocked his rifle even before his eye focused on the scene before him. Moki crouched with bared teeth beside the buckskin and the mule, holding at bay one frightened little boy with curly blonde hair. Behind the child stood the couple Jim had encountered in the doorway. The man, white-faced, held a pistol leveled at Moki's head. With a yell of rage, Jim sprang forward. He seized the man's wrist and wrenched it upward as the pistol roared in his ear. Half deafened, he barely heard the woman's scream, the sound of shouts and running footsteps. The fellow was struggling angrily in his grasp. "Let go of me, you fool! It's a wolf!" "Wolf? Why—" Jim flung down the wrist he held, sending the pistol clattering to the ground. With a moccasined toe, he flipped the weapon out of reach. "You're the fool," he remarked. "That's my dog." There was a moment's silence as the man's pale eyes shifted from Jim to Moki and back again. "Dog?" he echoed. "What's going on? What's wrong here?" The crowd was gathering. Jim glanced up, snapped his rifle to his shoulder, and saw the first arrivals stop in their tracks and then fall back in a pace. fall back a pace. At the same time, he gave a low whistle that released Moki from his duty, as the dog came trotting forward, wagging his tail and whining a relieved greeting. The astonishment on the faces before Jim suddenly struck his boisterous Indian sense of humor. He grinned broadly as he lowered the gun. To his surprise, an answering grin spread over the face of the golden-haired little boy. "Say," breathed that boy, "he is a dog, ain't he? I guess I made him mad, but I never meant to. I only tried to pet that horse there. Is that your horse? My, but she's pretty. That'll do. You get on back to your folks now. Do you hear?" The woman's eyes flashed suspiciously at Jim as she reached for the child's collar and hustled him through the crowd and away. The man retrieved his pistol and stood a moment staring at Jim. "Dog or wolf, the critter's a menace," he said. "Oughter be tied up." "By golly, you're right," muttered someone else. "These wild Injuns and their hounds." "You ask me, they both oughter be tied up," said a louder voice. "Just see him aim that rifle point blank at us a minute ago? Why, he blamed near. Leave him be, folks. I know him. It's just Injun Jim." This was the trader's rasping voice from the doorway of the post. "Your hair's safe if you don't touch that horse of his." He went back into the building, and the men scattered reluctantly, casting hostile glances over their shoulders as they lumbered away in their cracked and broken greenhorns boots. Jim turned to quiet the nervous mare, glaring scornfully now at the wagons and their owners. "Bourgeois," he thought. "What have they got to be so get out of the road about? Ain't got the sense to know a dog from a wolf? Tucker theirselves out wearing factory boots in Moccasin country." He felt his anger dissolve into a nagging uneasiness. Injun Jim! He was as white as these folks. Even his medicine was white. He frowned, his mind suddenly full of that unread paper. Where was this mysterious valley, and how did he get there? He had to know. He must go back to the post. He dug one of the smaller pelts out of his possibles, wondering what Harris would consider worth his while. Everything in him bucked and shied at the idea of entrusting his magic paper to that peddler. Under ordinary circumstances, he would no more have showed it to him than he would have revealed the contents of his medicine bundle. To quiet his uneasiness, he took the bundle from his pouch and tied it under his left braid. It calmed him a little, but he had felt less vulnerable prowling among enemy lodges, a stolen horse trailing from each hand. Back in the post, the big red-bearded man was paying for his calico with a bag of gunpowder. He looked around, and so did everyone else in the place, as Jim tossed his beaver on the counter in front of the trader. "I want something read to me," Jim said quietly. "You back again?" Harris dropped the bag of gunpowder into a drawer and propped his elbows on the counter, grinning. "All right, what's your pay? This here plew? Why, shucks, this ain't enough for my readin'. I reckon it's enough," Jim said very softly. Harris glanced at his face. All right. It's enough this time." He flipped the plew to one side and reached across the counter, winking at the man with the red beard, who stood nearest. "Let's have your piece of writin'. What is it, a billy-do from some little digger squaw?" "No, it ain't." Jim felt the hot blood climb to his hairline. He drew the paper from his pouch. There would be specific directions in it, rivers named, mountains identified, perhaps a promise of much beaver. Did he want to share it with all those bourgeois eyes and ears behind him? But Harris already had the paper. He opened it with careless fingers and began to read loudly. "Jim, if you're still alive, come help us. Pa's been dead 3 year, and Mother—" Jim gasped. "Wait, that's private. Gimme that." Harris only bellowed louder. "And Mother died 2 months ago. We buried her by the—" Something exploded in Jim's head. Before he knew he had moved, his knife was at Harris's fat throat, Gimme my letter, he breathed into a sudden dead silence. The trader's body went rigid. His glassy eyes, as they clung to that poised brown fist and the steel that glint from it, then moved up to meet Jim's stare. Abruptly, his face was bathed in sweat. Slowly, careful to move nothing but his hand, he extended the paper. Jim snatched it and turned a face like stone to that room full of alien eyes and ears. Blindly, he pushed through them and was gone. A stir rippled over the room as people let go their held breaths and shot glances at one another. By golly, Harris, muttered someone, you nigh got what you asked for that time. Harris said nothing. He was sagging on the counter, mopping at his white face. But the big red-bearded man, darting him one look of contempt, moved quietly through the crowd and out the door. The trampled mud was under Jim's moccasins, the cold wind on his back, his hands moving over Buckskin's warm, muscled neck in the pretense of adjusting her halter. Even when the worst of his outrage had passed, he stood sick and empty. He raised the crumpled note and stared at it hopelessly. Mother, dead, buried. He had to know the rest, but how? 15 armed Sioux couldn't drag him back to that post. There was a footstep, then a slow, quiet voice at his elbow. Son, I reckon you must be Jim Keith. He wheeled to face the huge, red-bearded man who had watched it all. For a moment he stared into a grave but gentle blue eyes. Then the man said, My name's Rutledge, son. I knew your mother. Will you let me read that to you? A great, painful knot untied itself in Jim's chest. Wordlessly, he handed over the paper. Rutledge smoothed it, his eyes clinging for an instant to Jim's braids and coo feather before they returned to the message. Jim, if you're still alive, come help us, he read. Pa's been dead 3 years and Mother died on the trail 2 months ago. We buried her beside the Sweetwater. Now me and Sally and Dan'l is all that's left. We are just across the Snake, bound for the Willamette Valley, and none of us old enough to claim land after we get there, except you. If you ever cared anything for Mother or any of us, then come. It's our only chance. Johnny. There was a silence in which even the roar of the river seemed to recede into a far and dreamlike whisper. Then Rutledge's big hands folded the note, carefully and slowly, and handed it back. His face was troubled but kind. They're here, in the Dalles now, son, he said softly. You want I should take you to him? Jim nodded. His breath was deep and hard, his whole mind full of awe. He knew now which valley he must go to, and why everything had happened just as it had. He was to find Johnny again. That's what the paper meant. He was to go home. His medicine was more powerful than he had dreamed.